So what are China, Iran, and the United States up to again? Right now, we're discussing the conflict in Iran and why it is happening and why it's actually not a good idea. Why it's not a good idea, we've basically said that this attack on Iran, it dramatically increases oil prices, it raises tensions, and Iran is capable of doing it quite effectively at the moment when it attacks Saudi Arabia and all these places. Overall, it complicates things and makes the war much more expensive. And that's what is assumed. And Iran probably assumes that too, that as the price of oil goes up, people in America will start putting pressure on Trump to stop the war, and people in Europe as well. They will start putting pressure on their governments to push the United States to stop the war, and overall, Iran will try to create the impression that there isn't much to gain in this war. And there is a lot to lose, so the war should be stopped. Most likely, the Iranian regime will really be able to hold on because it can make things unpleasant enough, and in the end, America will have to settle for destroying their missile industry, their nuclear industry, their navy, and all those things. However, in this respect, they will have to back off a bit, and the regime in Iran will somehow hold on, but it will be significantly weakened, significantly isolated, and so on. A huge problem is that there could be some kind of collapse of the state because of how weakened it will be, that the Kurds could start some actions there, that it could lead to a civil war and all those things. So regarding Iran, it's really problematic in that, on one hand, we're not actually able to win any kind of freedom for the Iranian people or anything like that. And for that reason, the price we're paying in the form of expensive oil and so on doesn't really have the value of what we could achieve. And what we could achieve is basically mainly a civil war in Iran or some other form of dictatorship in Iran. So the added value of that conflict just isn't there. We just don't feel it. But what isn't talked about much, and it's more of a thing I'm just throwing out there now and that I find interesting, is what the connection is. The connection between Iran and China. Because we've already said that, of course, this war in a way suits Russia, because oil prices, as we've said, are rising. Here we have a destroyed fleet, which will still have some connection. The destroyed fleet of Iran will have an impact, but oil prices are rising, gas prices are rising, and all of this suits Russia, because Russia profits when the price of oil or the price of gas is high. However, the problem is that Russia was reselling quite a lot of oil through Iran, so now their trade might be disrupted, but that's not the main aspect of this whole war. Russia will probably really profit, and in fact, this situation is more advantageous than disadvantageous for them, at least in terms of how much money they get into their treasury. Because if Iran is out of the game for a while, Turkey will still take oil and gas from Russia, and most likely Hungary and Slovakia will try to take at least some as well. China will take it in some way, maybe India too. Simply put, the oil will flow mainly to China and India, but especially to China. However, the truth is that if Iran is not really active, the pipelines that currently go to China through Kazakhstan, through Pakistan, through Turkmenistan, and so on, and of course also in eastern China, these pipelines won't have enough capacity to cover China's absolute demands, and China won't be able to take a significantly larger amount of oil than it already does at this moment. And now we're getting to the heart of the matter. Not just Iran, right? Not just Iran. Iran, of course, also supplies oil to China, but this whole region, this whole area connected to the Hormuz Strait is extremely important for China because China depends on oil that flows through the Hormuz Strait. 45% of the oil that gets to China passes through here, through this narrow passage, which is currently a dangerous hot zone where missiles are flying, where it's so dangerous that most ships can't even pass through because the insurance for ships passing through this strait, this passage, has become so expensive that it's not worth the risk. And most likely, those ships wouldn't even be insured by the insurance companies. And that's the problem. However, that brings us to why maybe the Americans can actually do the whole thing. Maybe this isn't about liberating the Iranian people at all. That's probably not what it's about. Most likely, it's not about liberating the Iranian people. Most likely, it's not entirely about preserving Israel. And it's definitely not about protecting Europe from missile attacks. That's nonsense. That's just talk. The idea that Iran will fire missiles at Europe is nonsense, just like the claim that Iraq had chemical weapons. Don't listen to that at all. But what this is really about, and what's interesting in connection with the fact that we have a lot of satellite images showing Americans destroying the Iranian Navy, is that the Americans will start to gain control over the Hormuz Strait if they eliminate the Iranian Navy, if they weaken Iran completely. And at that moment, they will have their finger on the artery that keeps China running. 45% of all oil. And now you might be saying, that's a lie. Like the Americans have bases in Qatar, they have bases in Saudi Arabia, they could close the Hormuz Strait too. Just like Iran can close the Hormuz Strait by causing chaos there, for exactly the same reason and in exactly the same way, the Americans could close the strait by causing chaos there too. Sure? But you don't want to close the strait completely for everyone. You don't want to disrupt the trade that flows here. You don't want to totally mess up the world economy just because you want to weaken China. So sure, you could mess up the strait, just like Iran is doing now, and then benefit from it. You know, China would be weakened, but at the same time, you'd hurt everyone else too. Do you want to break Iran into pieces? To control the strait and decide who gets to pass through and who doesn't. So you want to keep control over how much oil, how many ships, and how much of everything goes from the Persian Gulf to China, and you want to have the option to close it, but not by mining it and blocking everyone. You want to have the option to close it and say from now on not a single liter of diesel or oil will go through to China. Every ship heading to China will be sunk or seized. You want to be able to say that. Let's talk about it as piracy, maybe, but rather let's talk about it as geopolitical naval operations against China and as massive pressure that you can exert on China in the Hormuz Strait to make China stop messing around with Taiwan. So that, of course, you as the United States can put massive pressure on China. So if this is happening, then Donald Trump's administration is playing a more interesting and more sophisticated game than we would assume, than most people assume, and then they are even given credit for, as an option to play. But if we assume that Donald Trump and his administration are not idiots and are actually smart, then theoretically, in the Hormuz Strait, it could be about, of course, bombing and weakening Iran, but primarily it could be about starting to bully China through that strait. China will see that American ships are holding the strait on which it depends for 45%. Sure. This could happen if the Americans gained control. Maybe if Iran was completely weakened, to the point of being totally non-functional. If the Americans put some boots on the ground here and occupied some coastal areas, for example, or if they outright enforced absolute naval dominance here, that would lead to it. That would lead to it. And that's something that is possible, by the way. It's not completely impossible. So yes, this could be a much more extensive geopolitical operation than just bombing Iran, but bombing Iran is actually the only thing that the public would accept. That's the only thing the public will accept, and you can wrap it up by saying you want to somehow liberate the Iranians. But in reality, you don't care about the Iranians at all. You don't really care much about Iran either, but you're selling it through Iran just to kick some ass over there. So yeah, write in the comments what you think about this. It's actually more of an overcomplicated operation, but it seems to me that it follows a certain logic and makes sense to some extent. And there were really interesting points here that it was actually people in the chat who, rather than suggesting, more like outlined this theory. So thank you for this heads up. And personally, at this moment, I don't see the operation in Iran as entirely positive, because it still reeks of civil war there, and it still puts Europe at quite a disadvantage. And it's more or less very bad for us, because there's a threat of a refugee wave. Because really, higher prices are a threat and all that, but I'm starting to stop seeing it as a complete geopolitical blunder, because there might be a much bigger game going on behind the scenes. But if in the next 2 weeks we find out that the Americans just bombed Iran and then sailed away, then they're idiots, like 100% idiots, that's clear. So that's it, ladies and gentlemen. Let me know. And for now, bye. I'm going to continue streaming.